All right, welcome into Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. I'm your host, Stephen MacDonald. This is episode 17. And real quick, I want to give a shout out to all my fellow Michiganders because we made it. We made it through 2 months of quarantine, and Governor Whitmer yesterday announcing the end of her stay-at-home orders, basically effective immediately. Although for most restaurants and things like that, they won't be open to dine-in services until next Monday. But in all, we made it. So shout out to all you guys. But what I want to get to with this episode is the article by CBS Sports ranking the Big Ten football strengths of schedule for 2020. And just a couple of my takeaways from that. And specifically, I'll be focusing on Michigan State, Michigan, and Ohio State from this article. Starting with Michigan State, who checks in at number 1 in strength of schedule in the Big Ten for 2020. They have an above average strength of schedule overall, but just an average or slightly above average Big Ten schedule. And their non-conference includes a road trip to BYU, and then they come home and play against Toledo and Miami U. Now, keep in mind that later on, when they get into their Big Ten schedule, they also have to play the likes of Michigan, Penn State, and Ohio State at some point because they're within their division. But at least luckily for them, only Penn State is on the road this year. But Michigan State basically gets no breaks the first month and a half or so of their Big Ten schedule because they start with at Iowa, home against Michigan, home against Ohio State, at Indiana, home against Minnesota, and then a bye week before going at Penn State. And then I would say that I wouldn't be all that surprised if Michigan State were to finish Mel Tucker's first year 5-7 overall, but really having to beat Rutgers and Maryland in the last 2 weeks in order to do it. If you go back to 2019, they had to do that same exact thing by beating Rutgers and Maryland, but to earn bowl eligibility, going 6-6 before winning that Pinstripe Bowl game against Wake Forest to finish 7-6 for the 2019 season. Then you don't have to go much farther down the list to find Michigan. They sit at number 3 in the strength of schedule rankings for 2020 after finishing 2019 9-4 after losing to Ohio State and Alabama to finish their campaign. The Wolverines will open 2020 with a visit to Washington, who is a team that's replacing both their starting quarterback and head coach from last year. Then a few weeks later, they have to open their Big Ten schedule with home games against Wisconsin and Penn State in back-to-back weeks. And I've seen a lot of predictions saying that they could lose one, if not both, of those games. And I personally don't think it's going to happen because neither Wisconsin or Penn State have beaten Michigan in Ann Arbor under Jim Harbaugh. And I think that in year 6, that'll remain the case. But still, those are going to be 2 very tough games. Then they follow that up with road games at Michigan State and at Minnesota. And for me personally, the Minnesota game kind of scares me more because of what we saw that offense can be capable of in 2019 with Tanner Morgan. And I think that they'll do a lot of that same stuff this year with him being able to throw to guys like Rashad Bateman. And then, of course, comes the part of the schedule where Harbaugh has most notably had the most trouble with, and that's beating Ohio State in that final game of the year and then going into postseason play and being able to come away with a victory to end the season on kind of a high note. He is, of course, 0-5 against Ohio State between both Urban Meyer and now Ryan Day last year. And he is 1-4 in bowl games after dropping his last 4. So obviously you would hope that this could possibly be the year where he finally kind of gets over that hump and finally is able to end the season on a high note, as I mentioned. So if Michigan can somehow win that opener against Washington, because keep in mind Michigan will also be breaking in sort of a new quarterback into this offense, whether it's Dylan McCaffrey, Joe Milton, or possibly even Cade McNamara could be a dark horse in that quarterback race. If Michigan, though, is somehow able to win that opener against Washington, they could be heading to Columbus 10-1. Otherwise, it'll be somewhere around 9-2, staring at a potential 3rd loss on the year coming from Ohio State. and then an equally as hard to come by bowl win being a possible fourth loss, which would result in back-to-back 9-4 seasons for Jim Harbaugh. Then this time you have to drop a little bit further down the list, all the way down to number 10, where Ohio State sits, where they have the fourth easiest schedule in all the Big Ten. Now only Rutgers, Indiana, Northwestern, and Illinois have easier strengths of schedule this year. Now, Ohio State will open with Bowling Green before they have to travel to Oregon. Now, Oregon playing without Justin Herbert, who was drafted in the first round this past April. And then the Buckeyes will go back home to play to Buffalo, Rutgers, and Iowa at the Horseshoe before going back on the road to play Michigan State and Penn State in back-to-back weeks. From there, the schedule gets a lot easier for them as they play a lot of the divisional teams in that Eastern Division until they play Michigan, which is for them at home. So at worst, in my opinion, Ohio State will be 10-1 going into that game against Michigan in Week 13, with their lone loss possibly coming from Penn State, where they have to go on the road to Happy Valley. Otherwise, beside that game, they could be 11-0 heading into that game with Michigan. That shouldn't really scare them too much, seeing as how they've averaged almost 60 points per game against Michigan each of the last 2 years. So that's what I wanted to get to with this episode 17 of Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. Make sure to like, share, and comment on this post. Let me know what you guys think about the upcoming seasons for Michigan State, Michigan, Ohio State, and maybe some of the other schools in the Big Ten that I didn't necessarily touch on, maybe Wisconsin, Penn State, Minnesota, whoever you guys want to talk about, we can get into that as well. But that'll do it for this one. Thanks for listening.